So I just want to talk a little bit about this panel and let you know what was on my mind when I created it and when I sent out invitations to ask these people to speak at our conference. There are certain subjects that are in the newspaper every day, and that's great. They're very important, and they should be. And there are certain subjects that somehow the normal, smart, intelligent people that I know do not seem to think about, they don't seem to talk about, they don't seem very concerned. And I understand it, subjects like chemicals and pesticides and soil and water and GMO'S, they don't seem day to day to be that big a deal. But when you hear these people speak in person, on video, when you read their books, you feel outraged that this is not being dealt with. In other words, adults in society are responsible for the future. We're responsible for the children. Some people say, I don't like bad news, I don't want anything that's negative, and neither do I, but I'm a 55-year-old man. There are children in this world, including my own. I am not supposed to put my head in the sand and avoid things. I'd much rather avoid it if I could, but I can't. There's realities going on, and we as adults are responsible to understand and learn what the truth is, and then take consistent, significant action in our own lives, in the people we elect, and some of the things that are being discussed have tremendous implications on us and on the future. I listen to each of these people speak, and whether we're talking about the GMO'S and the future of that industry, or what's going on with pesticides and chemicals, or how we're treating the land, the soil, the environment, the water, the forests, the coral reefs, the ocean acidification, the species extinction, it goes on and on. It is really important things that I am praying that someone says, wait a minute, this is outrageous. I am hoping you will be completely outraged that people in our society who are responsible are, instead of taking care of these urgent issues, they're saying, I am going to be more concerned with how it affects the economy and businesses. And it's great to take care of the economy and businesses. I'm a pro-business person. I'm not a liberal person. I'm pro-business. I like business. But it is completely outrageous if people in positions of authority are not telling us the truth and intentionally doing things that will cause us diseases, death for us, for the future, for our children, our planet. I don't know of people who are better at explaining this than the people on this panel. They have written books, they've devoted their time, and for whatever their reasons are, they have written about this. They've chosen to make this a priority, and I am very, very grateful to them. I appreciate that they have done this, and I really when we have this conference, I know people love the nutrition stuff, they love the vegan versus the Atkins stuff, but the stuff that's being talked about here was urgent in 1970. It's 2018. I am praying that people will hear it, will listen, and will use all their abilities to try to make a difference in this. So, although I have been the moderator of all the panels, for this one panel, I have asked if Jeffrey Smith would be, due to his knowledge, would take it over, ask the questions, and participate on it. And I am very grateful, and I am going to turn it over to Jeffrey. And once again, just while I have you on stage, I want to thank each of you for writing a book. I want to thank you, Vandana, for all the work you've done, the videos, everything. I'm really grateful for what all of you do. Thank you.
And thank you, Stephen. And Stephen has allowed me to be the moderator, but he has handed me his 100 questions. Literally 100 questions. We'll just put that over here. Okay. So each of us are going to have already spoken or will speak and give our whole presentation. So I know that I spent years, 23 years, studying this issue, and what we give out in our introductory lectures is less than 1% of 1% of what we know. So I like panels to be an opportunity to speak on areas that we don't normally speak on, to go deep in areas or personal in areas or bring out our wisdom. And so I want to start the panel by asking, first of all, Vandana, you traveled the longest to get here, so you get to go first. And I'd like you to answer this question. Just start the thing as, I am passionate about, and then fill the rest of that, whatever that is, I am passionate about, something we get to know you better about, and then finish by saying, and the one thing I want you to know is. So, I'm forcing the distilling of the information. I'm passionate about blank, and the one thing I want you to know at the end of your passionate speech is blank. You may go anytime.
That makes my mind go blank.
Yes, Vandana is one of the most articulate speakers on the planet, and I just scripted her. So, my
I won't follow the script.
That's fine.
I will mention why I work on food and agriculture. It isn't the field of my training. I trained in physics. I did a Ph.D. on the foundations of quantum theory. And I really got involved with looking at agriculture because in the year 1984, there were two disasters that hit India. In the summer of 1984, and it's interesting, Orwell chose that year for his amazing book. And I don't know how many of you are aware that George Orwell was born in India. The place in Champaran, in Motihari, where Gandhi did his first satyagraha against the forced cultivation of indigo. Gandhi returned from South Africa in 1915. And by 1917, he'd been called by the movement that was fighting the forced cultivation of indigo. Now, indigo at that time was so valuable that a bag full of indigo used to be exchanged for a bag of gold. And so, of course, once the British had taken control, they wanted to control indigo and expand the name of the place, Champaran, actually means the land of the forest of the champa flower. It used to be a forest. And now farmers and peasants were being forced to grow indigo under slave conditions. The entire cotton empire was based on slavery. And last year I did a pilgrimage for freedom because it was 100 years of Gandhi's Champaran Satyagraha. The word Satyagraha is derived from Satya, truth, Agrah, force, the force of truth. And that's what I'm passionate about. Both the truth, but the force of truth when truth is violated systemically. And I realized in 1984 that what we'd been told about the story of industrial agriculture, something was wrong with the narrative. So 4th of June, Punjab, the land where the Green Revolution, which is the name of the chemical agriculture introduced to the Third World, the Green Revolution was given a Nobel Peace Prize to Norman Borlaug, who introduced the chemical farming to places like Mexico and India. And he, interestingly, had come from DuPont Defense Labs to start the research. And it's not an accident that he came from Defense Labs because agrochemicals came from Hitler's Germany. Since many of you raised your eyebrows on that, may I go a little
Please,
longer?
Absolutely.
And I found this out in my research on the Green Revolution in Punjab. I was working for the United Nations University those days, and I said, something is funny, and I must look. By 2nd of November, a second disaster had hit India, which is a leak of a pesticide plant, owned then by Union Carbide, now by Dow, which has merged with DuPont. So I realized in this research I did for the United Nations University that the chemicals had actually, all agrochemicals have their origins in Hitler's Germany. Fertilizers, about which I don't think anyone who's worried about eating even thinks about chemical fertilizers as a problem. But they are. First of all, they were made in the same factories that made the ammunitions and the explosives. That's why so often you will hear about fertilizer bombs. Afghanistan is full of fertilizer bombs because to deal with the Soviets, the Americans gave sacks and sacks and sacks of urea. So today you have ready-made explosive material everywhere with the Taliban. And the violence doesn't stop. But the pesticides have their origins in the chemicals designed to kill people in concentration camps, beginning with Xylon B. Now, the companies that started to make it were tried for genocide in the Nuremberg trials. They were called, what was their name in Germany?
LG Farben.
IG Farben. And interestingly, Standard Oil and IG Farben had partnerships. Monsanto and Bayer had Mobe. They were all partnerships. So the American side and the German side were all working together. And Bayer was given the job, work out a way to kill all these millions. And when Bhopal happened, the women of Bhopal said they've turned us into a gas chamber. They didn't know too much of the history of where the chemical fertilizers, pesticides come. And then herbicides, the big one was Agent Orange, used in the Vietnam War. So all chemicals in farming are a continuation of war after war ended. And all makers of chemicals for agriculture are nothing more than criminals making poisons to kill people. Then they say it'll kill insects, but it's still killing people. And you have written so much about this and the whole Monsanto story. So my passion for truth really made me look at, if the Peace Prize went to the Green Revolution and the land where I did my MSc honors in particle physics, which was a peaceful land of Punjab, was now a land of war, what went wrong? And I realized what went wrong is that war, chemicals, entered food. And for so long, we've been prevented from knowing this. I know when I wrote my book, it was the first book on the ecology of agriculture, of chemical farming. So I'd get invited. I'd get invited, and the next day I'd get a disinvite saying, our board said if you get called, then our funding would stop. So from 80s onwards, I've seen how so much funding in food and agriculture is dependent on the very people who are destroying the planet and our health. Mm-hmm. And so the second passion I have is freedom. Work with less, but do it freely. And all science, the true science of today, is only coming out of places where, with very little resources, people like Eric Cervellini did that first study on GMO'S and glyphosate. And not only, this is what the whole Monsanto papers have revealed, not only do they finance fake research, they spend a lot of money drowning real research. And so my familiarity with these corporations has really been, the poor Sicilian peasants dealing with the mafia. It's basically having to deal with the mafia, which can change your laws. I have done a lot of work on the pharmaceuticals in India. First, they attacked me for it. They troll me. And when I continue to speak, they've just managed to get 2 years ago our government to shut down the data on pharmaceuticals, as if the suicides will go away if governments don't count. But then we go to the regions, we actually go to the communities, and we spend time, find out the problem, but more importantly, offer the alternative. My third passion is nonviolence, from Gandhi's Ahimsa. And I feel so happy that with the suicides, we started to work on organic cotton. I began my work with seeds for food. just was in Vidarbha, the capital of BT cotton and the capital of suicides. In the villages where we are working, the BT cotton GMO is down 60%. And we are going to keep working till it's zero. And each of us have to get rid of the GMOs in our farming systems and our food, and we have to get rid of the chemicals which have been brought by the same companies that bring us the GMOs. And I heard a talk in the morning. I mean, you are in a country where every big problem that is of these created by the global giants, they've been very successful in this country to turn it into your private problem. And for you to find your private solution. And of course, responsibility is a very important part. But when it's criminal giants ruling our food and agriculture systems, solidarity has to be the other part, and our global citizenship, our planetary citizenship. We can't imagine that a few % of the people shifting to better diets is going to save the planet or people elsewhere. This is both a collective right and a collective responsibility.
Thank you, Vandana. Carey.
I'm up, huh?
Yeah, yes.
Everything she said. No, so I'm passionate. I was going to say truth, but you took it, so I'm going to say...
It never gets taken away. Just gets multiplied.
As a journalist, I've been a journalist for 30 years, and so truth is foundational to what I do. Truth and transparency is what the foundation of everything that you pursue as a journalist. And I became part of this conversation about food and agriculture about 20 years ago. And as part of covering this for Reuters, I started learning about GMOs, learning about the pesticides that were being used in agriculture, studying the science, meeting with a whole host of different people, from farmers to the CEOs of very powerful corporations. And what led me to write the book, and what led me to where I am today speaking to you, is because what I was learning and what I was seeing and what I was beginning to understand, which was very, very frightening, was information was really hard to get, that was not out there for the general public to see. Information about the science that shows the very harmful impacts of pesticides in our food, pesticides on human health, pesticide impacts on environmental health. All of this information that's out there and that's important to our future generations was being hidden, was being suppressed, and scientists who were trying to bring this information to light were being harassed and discredited and trolled, as you say. And I'm most passionate, above all else, about children, about my own children, about your children, about my children's future children. I think as caring, responsible, people, citizens of this world, we need to be sure that we are creating a world, for our children to experience and to live in, and it needs to be as healthy and sustainable as it can be. We don't want to be leaving a world for our children to be sick in and to suffer and to endure disease and pain and early death. But that's what we're doing. That's what we're creating with this toxic environment. And there are many factors other than pesticides, certainly, that contribute to disease, that contribute to cancers and other forms of disease, and infertility and reproductive problems and ADHD and autism and all of these neurodevelopmental things that we're seeing in our children today. There are other aspects to it than pesticides, sure, but pesticides are part of it. They are a problem. And what I've seen in my research, and I spoke about this the other day, is it's very, very clear. If you look at where we were 20 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, and you look at where we are today, we have created a pervasive pesticide-dependent food system. And the main beneficiaries of this are a handful of giant corporations who are counting billions of dollars in profits while we are all getting sicker. And that's the truth. That's what the documents show us. That's what they don't want us to know. So I'm passionate about children. If there's one thing, what's the rule here? What are you trying to say? If there's one thing I want you to remember,
To know.
one key point you take away, is our only defense, our only means to creating a healthier future is education. Is we have to be informed, we have to be educated, and it's not an easy task. It's not easy to get there because there are very powerful forces. They're trying to control the narrative, they're trying to control the science, they're trying to control the regulators, the lawmakers, they're trying to confuse consumers and farmers and others about what is true, about the safety of their products and the risks associated with them. So, you all are doing the work right here. You're here. You're learning. You're sharing what you know. You're listening to us, so this is really important. And I guess that's the one takeaway: is we just need to continue to learn and to educate ourselves and try to share the information with others. So hopefully we can do something about it for our kids.
And Caitlin.
Wait a minute. How about you first?
No. I'm the moderator.
We've got truth, children, nonviolence. Freedom. There's nothing else for me to say. My cat. Let's see. To try to say something that, because I agree with everything that's been said before me, I'll try to say something that's different. When I was working on Modified, before I even started working on it, I published a piece in Elle magazine called The Bad Seed that was about GMO corn, and it went viral, and I got a lot of blowback from the industry, from Big Ag, and it was the same week that they were trying to destroy my career as a writer. I'd already published 2 books, and I was reluctant, honestly, to write about agriculture, completely reluctant, and I'll tell you more about that. But that same week that piece came out, I had editors calling me from all of the biggest publishing houses in New York asking me to write a book on the same subject. And I turned a lot of them down, but it was a completely bipolar week because I had these hired journalist hacks from Monsanto and other places who were trying to destroy my career at the same time that I had these editors calling, trying to lift up my career. And I was so rattled by the whole thing. But I ended up agreeing to write a book with one editor. Lots of them wanted me to have a smoking gun. They wanted me to be able to write something that would say GMOs are bad and because of X, and that I was able to uncover this one sort of amazing truth. And I didn't know that we were there yet, or that I was the person to find that. I'm a mother and a storyteller. I've written about divorce and the recession. I've written fiction. And I like great stories, but I'm not necessarily an activist by any stretch. And I never considered myself to be an activist. I feel passionately and I feel deeply, but I don't hook on to an idea and become the spokesperson for it. That's just not who I am. And I write for a lot of different publications, the New York Times. I worked for NPR for a long time, and part of my job was always to walk a middle line and ask the same balanced questions of both sides. At any rate, when I signed on to do this book, the editor I spoke with, that I finally went with after I had turned down, 10 or 12 people, was, I said to her, well, I'm willing to go out there and have a journey, and I'm willing to ask some questions, but I don't know where we're going to end up. I may have no answers by the end. And she said, that's okay. Where do you want to go? And I said, well, I've got a list. And she said, great. And then at the end of that phone call, she said, Caitlin, are you scared? And I said, well, I wasn't until you said anything. So what I will say that I'm passionate about, what I realized I became incredibly passionate is kind of the wrong word. But I remember I drove across the Great Plains. I live in Maine, and I have 2 little kids. At that time, I didn't have the second child yet. I decided to do that and the book on science at the same time. That seemed like a wise choice. But I flew out to Denver, and I drove across the Great Plains by myself. And I listened to Ryan Adams the whole time and Lucinda Williams, and it was great. And I got to see America from the ground, and I got to see what Michael Pollan talked about, those corn cities where the corn is planted right up to the side of the road, where Jeffrey lives. And I remember at the end of that trip, after I had driven across all of that, getting on an airplane and going up in the plane and looking down at the sloughs, which are like little ponds that were glittering like jewels. And the sun was hitting them, and the corn everywhere, and maybe in the far distance one tree, maybe a second tree, probably not. And my heart just broke. My heart just broke as a mom, as a person on this planet, all of the wetlands that have been filled in, maybe left like, a 5-foot patch, a wetland reclamation area. And I thought, what have we done? Who did this? Why did we let this happen? And the burden, I realized, was on all of us. We let this happen. We did this. I did this. And so I think that what's become the thing for me is not so much the GMO necessarily, and certainly, of course, the pesticides and the toxins were pounding into the environment, but just the enormity of the problem, how layered it is, how much money is being made, how much power there is involved in this, and how serious the situation is. And I can't tell you how many nights I go to bed, and as I said, I have 2 small children, one 10 and one 4, and I sleep with the curtains open so that I can see the moon and the stars, and the moon often wakes me up at night. And I just lie there and I think, what are we gonna do? What are we gonna do? How are we gonna roll this back? And so passion might not be the right word for what I feel, but the environmental situation we're in is so serious, it's gonna take all feet on the ground, all hands at the table, and we've got a lot of work to do. And it's not just GMOs, it's pesticides, it's not just that, it's oil, it's not just oil, it's the lack of nutrients in our soil, it's not just the air, it's our water. I mean, you get to one and you start to work on it, and then you realize there are 15 more. There's plastic, there's petroleum products, there's, I could enumerate them all. So that's where I am. And thank you for the things that you both said. Appreciate it.
I am passionate about protecting the earth from what could be a replacement of nature in this generation. With the inexpensive gene editing and GMOs out there, we are seeing a gold rush against the genome. And if we don't stop it, then all future generations will inherit the folly of this generation, a nature replaced with a vision from Monsanto and Bayer. And there's no technology today to clean that up. But the thing that I want you to know, and I'm also passionate about, is that we can champion this and other causes. And we can take an attitude and choose the attitude to not be the victim, but be the victor. So that we get to choose what we consider food and not have it dictated to us by Monsanto Bayer and their enforcement wing in Washington. We get to choose and we get to create. There has been a suppression and oppression of personal freedom and responsibility such that the lack of taking responsibility is the epidemic. And the antidote is personal development, freedom, taking responsibility, and I say we can do this with great joy and hope, and spread that with the message. That's an inspiring message, and that we can protect the world and transform it. On the other hand, I have a question about the other side. What is the most shocking discovery or story, or one of them that you have encountered that you would like to share that gives an understanding of what you have discovered or what we're up against? Some story of, oh my God, they're really doing this. And then perhaps the next question will be a story that's on the more positive side. Why don't you start first, Carey, because you...
I can't, there's so many. I mean, there are so many.
Just pick one. It doesn't have to be the most, just one that you'd like to share.
So writing the book for me was really eye-opening because as a reporter, you know, you write, I mean, sometimes at Reuters I'd write 5 stories a day, literally 5 stories a day. So, you know, it's bits and pieces and you have this and this, but when I took time to sit down and to write this book and to put all of these things together and all of these stories together, I mean, I would just stop and I'd go, oh my God, like this is bad, you know, this is, I think for me, it's the deceptiveness that has gone on. And I was asked to speak at the European Parliament to testify when they were considering the re-registration of glyphosate in late 2017. And they had 6 scientists, international scientists, and then they had me, which was an incredibly surreal. I kept saying, are you sure you know who I am? Like, you know, why am I here? But they had me come and testify, and the title of my presentation was Decades of Deceit. And 30 seconds before it was my turn to address Parliament, I panicked, and I said, oh my gosh, like, I'm getting ready to accuse one of the largest companies in the world of decades of deceptive tactics, like right here in front of everybody, you know, on TV. Can I actually do that? And then I realized, yeah, because that's the truth, and we have the evidence of that. We have decades, at least 4 decades of deceptive tactics by Monsanto and some of their allies in the chemical industry, but Monsanto stands apart as sort of the biggest and the baddest and the, you know, I mean, the things that they have been doing. And I've covered corporate America for 30 years, and I covered the banking industry for a long time, and there's a lot of, you know, dirty tricks that go on. But the things that this company has done deceptively, strategically, they lay out plans. I know I've got to come up with one really good example. What one would it be? I mean, the ghostwriting, the scope of the ghostwriting that has gone on. You've heard a lot of that about ghostwriting scientific studies, and that's pretty outrageous as it is. You know, there's one in particular set of independent papers on the carcinogenicity of glyphosate, an independent panel. This was published in Critical Reviews in Toxicology. This refuted the International Agency for Research on Cancer. They were wrong. These scientists looked at all the evidence. Those scientists were wrong. Glyphosate doesn't cause cancer. It's totally safe. Independent panel. There's a declaration at the end of these papers. It says neither any Monsanto employee nor attorney nor, you know, reviewed or edited or had anything essentially to do with these papers. It says it right there. Then you look at these internal emails from Monsanto and you see them talking about writing these papers. You know, we're going to write this, I did this, I wrote this draft chapter, I'm moving this around, I'm doing this. By the way, who are we going to say is the author? You know, what independent scientist are we going to say is the author of this? I mean, that sort of thing. And you see it over and over and over. You see it going back decades. You see them talking about, we need this to happen, but we don't want anybody to know Monsanto's behind it. We need to create an international scientific outreach team, a team of scientists around the world who will get up and shout, glyphosate is non-toxic, you know, who will carry the water for us with policymakers and lawmakers and others. And we need no one to know that we're associated with them. You know, it's that sort of thing over and over again. You see them sending payments to universities, to professors at universities, and discussing how the money can be routed so that it doesn't have to be publicly disclosed. And at the same time, they're having these professors deliver presentations, and they're sending them slideshows, and they're sending them, you know, ideas for how they can make videos on the university dime, but they'll be, you know, Monsanto's got the idea and here's what it's supposed to look like. I mean, one of the best emails, I mean, just as a short little story, is a university professor, University of Illinois professor, and he's getting a lot of money coming from Monsanto, and they're sending him, I believe it was to India. Maybe it was India, maybe not. I can't remember now.
China. Is Bruce
Was
Chassie?
it China? And
Are you talking about Chassie?
I can't even remember. Yeah, and he's writing. I've forgotten, like, where am I going? Who am I talking to? What am I saying? Like, he's writing this to Monsanto, you know. But he went as an independent, you know. It's just, it goes on and on and on. So I didn't answer. I didn't pick a good anecdote, but
I think
the
you did
whole
great.
thing,
I
the
think
whole
you
thing
did
is
great.
just jaw dropping.
I think you did great. You gave us a real good dose. A real good dose. Thank you. Vandana, would you like to take it from there?
I think added to the issue of deception is this idea that if we just become so big, that our false claims will be the truth of the future. And whether, you know, Monsanto was never in the seed business. It's the biggest seed controller. And because they were getting a dirty name, partly because of books like yours,
Thank you.
they thought Bayer taking on the ownership would give them a big range. But Bayer just had to lay off, I think, 2,000 people. Because the day of
August 10th.
of the Johnson decision,
Verdict. August 10th.
they lost 35%. They thought they'd get bigger, and just like banks were supposed to be too big to fail in 2008,
Yeah.
the idea of I call these people the Poison Cartel, you know, just because how can you keep taking so many names when they're really just one cartel? You know, it's simpler. I'm trying to look at my little diagram of the Poison Cartel. Yeah, there they are. And on top, you know, IG Farben, but on the right-hand bottom is, guess what? Heroin. Bayer's first invention, not aspirin, heroin. Called heroin because it made the person who took it feel like a hero. So they're not just a poison cartel, they're a drug cartel. And the levels of concentration that they see as their defense mechanism against what people want as a food and agriculture system. In writing this new book called Oneness versus 1%, which should be available in this country, it's just been published in India, Monsanto has bought up the world's biggest climate data corporation.
Right.
It's bought up the world's biggest soil data corporation. Jointly, they want to control the agricultural insurance sector, which they expect to hit $3 trillion together, their agriculture business. They're getting big. If you notice now, they've stopped talking anything else but digital agriculture. Big data. And I have more to say on that, but I think this obscene levels of concentration, in India, our competition commission, our antitrust body, had rejected the merger of Bayer and Monsanto. One day before the general body meeting in Bonn, suddenly the Indian Competition Commission approved it. And the European Competition Commission, which is so strict on so many antitrust issues, cleared this very, very fast. The other thing we are finding, and part of the Poison Cartel, is when Bayer was buying Monsanto, I really wanted to know, you know, who's the controlling interest? Turns out it's billionaire money. The same people who hijack your elections. With dark money, hijack your food. With dark money. And if you look at all of these corporations, all of them, the biggest shareholders now are the big investment funds. not individual shareholders. And they're deciding what is profitable and what will bring them the fastest, quickest, highest return on investment. Sadly, criminality is very profitable business. And goodness is good living, but might not generate the trillions they're seeking. And so it is a very direct clash between the money machine, which owns the poison cartel, and our daily food, and our daily bread, and our daily freedom.
What's the question?
So tell us a story. You're a story writer, storyteller, and tell us about a shocking moment, something that really laid it out for you that conveys some deeper understanding to all of us about what you've encountered in your research.
Well, I think there were there were many. I think I, agree with Carey that there were many moments where, I felt shocked. I guess I would talk about just two moments in particular that were particularly astounding to me. I mean, I had a lot of weird things happen to me when I was working on this book, but one, I was interviewing Bruce Chastity, actually, who I was interviewing him back in 2013, and at that time he did not identify himself as a paid consultant for Monsanto, and the money trail hadn't been figured out yet. And he's a professor at the University of Illinois, and he was supposedly an independent scientist. But somebody had told me, perhaps it was you, I don't know, somebody had told me that there was some connection with him to Monsanto, and I don't remember exactly, but or that maybe he could shed some light on sort of their side of things. So I ended up on the phone with him, and it was kind of a shocking conversation because he was so amped up and so angry the entire conversation. But it became clear as I interviewed him, and then I hung up and I actually called him back, and we had he yelled at me. But what became clear was that actually he was economically tied to Monsanto. But that wasn't actually the most shocking thing, because I was expecting kind of to find that. What was shocking to me was that he told me about how our regulatory agencies, the USDA and the EPA and the FDA, how tied their hands were, and how the companies were in fact providing all of the data and telling the EPA and the USDA and the FDA when to jump, basically. And I was shocked by that because I still, I guess, naively assumed that our regulatory agencies were at least pushing the papers. And he laughed at me and he said, and this is the part that will always be seared in my mind, is he said they would have to back up 2 tractor trailer trucks of documents for each study, right? For looking at each, not even just each chemical, but like looking at the chemical from this angle, say. And the EPA, the USDA, the FDA, nobody has the staff to go through those papers, and they're not going to. So it's up to the company to then tell them, here's what we found, here's what you can say, and here's what's wrong or good, or what the upshot is of these studies. And so it was completely on their terms. We had nobody looking over those papers, nobody going through them, nobody calling them out. And I guess that was really shocking to me. That hadn't occurred to me before. Several years later, in 2015, my book was going to come out in a year, and it was the end of 2015, and we had just begun what ended up being 6 months of fact-checking and legal checking for the book, and it took forever. And I got a phone call from a reporter at the Times named Eric Lipton. Many of you may know him. He's an amazing reporter. And he said, you're in those emails. And I had a at that time, a 1-year-old child, and I had a book coming out, and I had no idea what emails he was even talking about. And it turned out that I was in these emails between a guy named Kevin Folta, who's a researcher in Florida, and Bruce Jassy, the same Bruce Jassy I'd interviewed a couple years ago. And when my piece, The Bad Seed, had come out in Elle magazine, they had been emailing each other, and with a guy named Eric Sachs at Monsanto, who had started the email chain about how to shut me down. How could they silence me? And as a mother of 2 children and a person with a book coming out and being a writer who had sort of stumbled into this agricultural story, I remember being really shocked by that and scared. And I felt like, who are these people actually? And how would that happen? It was a very startling moment for me. So I guess those are the two of the many moments. But another moment was when I was driving across the Great Plains and I had someone intimate that perhaps I would get kidnapped if I continued on the quest I was on. Those were all shocking to me. I hadn't ever encouraged I hadn't ever encountered anything like that before. So.
You know, I just remember that in 1998, when Monsanto brought its GMO'S, Bt cotton into India illegally because we had laws to regulate the approvals, imports, field trials, as well as commercialization. They were putting huge ads in the newspapers that next year Indian farmers would have the bollgard cotton, it's called, because it's supposed to protect the cotton from the bollworm pest. It doesn't, it fails in that. But I saw these ads, I'd been looking at this issue since the 80s, so I immediately rang up my Ministry of Agriculture and Ministry of Environment, said, did they get approval? Because Ministry of Environment needed to give approval for the releases long before the UN biosafety laws were put in place, and I was on the expert group to draft that. We had laws in India in '89 to regulate GMOs. So I rang up ministry and said, did you get an application from Monsanto? They said, we don't know Monsanto, we don't know Bt cotton, no application. I rang up Ministry of Agriculture because any seed is supposed to go through 2 years of trial, even non-GMO seed, 2 years of trial for adaptation to 22 agroecological zones that India has. And it's only when they're fit for that area they're approved for release. They said, we've never heard of this company. No one came to us. So I put the material together and tracked where their trials were and filed a case. Well, before I went to the court, they came to know I was filing the case. And I think it was 2 or 3 days before, I'm in the office and I'm getting call after call after call. And initially I would have my secretary pass it on. It's a call from Korea. It would be C.S. Prakash pretending to be in Korea. These were all the lobbyists who have been, now through the Monsanto papers, they're all out there. Call from Paris, another lobbyist, all threatening me, saying, if you file, serious consequences. And then I crossed over, my home is just a little walk away from the office. And those were days of landlines, no smartphones, no nothing. And at home, there were only 2 people who had my number. My sister and my son, who was studying in this country at that time. So when I entered, the phone rang, and I thought maybe my son's calling. So I ran and picked it up. And I get a call, now you can't pretend you're not home. We've just watched you enter, and we are warning you, don't file this case. So I rang up my close friend, and I rang up some of my close colleagues and asked them to come over and pick up the writ and make copies. And I said, 5 of you must be ready to submit it in the court on my behalf if I don't make it. but they didn't do anything after those threats, and we submitted. And those cases prevented the commercialization till 2002, by which time they learned how to bribe the Indian regulatory system like they bribed the system here. And now the sad thing is, every day we have to deal with not just Monsanto, but with the government standing by their side. And it's the way you have to deal with it, because more often than not, EPA and USDA are talking on their behalf rather than on behalf of the citizens of this country, whose environmental care and public health they should be looking after.
Some years ago, I was in Europe and I was introduced to a former Monsanto scientist who told me that 3 of his colleagues at Monsanto, who had studied the milk from cows treated with Monsanto's genetically engineered bovine growth hormone, they found in the milk such high levels of a cancer-promoting hormone, IGF-1, that the 3 Monsanto scientists decided to not drink milk again unless it was organic. One bought his own cow. He said that he also learned from other Monsanto scientists while at the company that they found that a genetically engineered corn damaged rats. But instead of withdrawing the corn, they rewrote the study to hide the effects. And his big concern was this: Monsanto's highest level of GMO corn that they use in their studies is 33%. But this man knew that in southern Africa, corn is a staple. The rats were fed the corn for 90 days. The people in South Africa eat it 3 times a day for their whole lives. So he was deeply concerned about the effects. I was interviewing a Midwestern veterinarian who had a client in South Africa. And he said that the client had terrible health problems with his pigs and cows. Pigs seemed like they were sometimes having Alzheimer's or dementia, and they were cannibalistic. The animal, there was very low milk production, etc. And he had given a long list of things for the South African farmer to do. And the farmer got frustrated and said, just say one thing I can do. And he said, okay, don't feed another GMO to your animals. So he planted non-GMO corn, and when it was harvested, he started feeding it to the pigs and to the cows, and they got better. He ran out, so he had to buy corn from the environment, from the field, from the market, and they got sick again. And then when he had year-round non-GMO corn growing, they got better and they were fine. But the workers on the farm were eating the corn grown on the farm. And when he was growing GMO corn, they were eating 100% GMO corn all day. And he needed 50 workers, but he had to keep 60 because 10 of them, or 20%, were always down with sickness. He had medicine cabinets full of medicines, severe headaches, flu-like symptoms. And he told the veterinarian that once or twice a month, he would be speaking to one of his workers, and he would notice that their eyes stopped tracking together but started to move independently, and within 1 or 2 days, they would be dead. He had no idea why. But when he grew the non-GMO corn and fed it to the animals, the workers got better because they were eating the non-GMO corn. And their health picked up, and it was fine until he ran out, and then it dove again with the animals. So I appreciated more what the former Monsanto scientist told me about his concerns about genetically engineering a staple food. And it's a tragedy what happened in that farm and what's probably happening in many South African farms. And unfortunately, they are probably eating more GMOs in their diet than anyone on the planet, any human. So in one sense, they're canaries telling us what's really going on. So that was one of the most shocking moments for me. So now that we have gone into Hitler's stockpile and shocking moments and threats, let's lighten the load here and let's talk about some great success that we've had or are experiencing now. Some good news that can share with the audience something to feel good about and to learn more about. And I want to say that all of us in this business, we do this sustainably. Vandana has been doing this on GMOs since the 80s. Hardly anyone has that length of time. And you are still going strong. So I'm going to give one hint here. We hear the outrageous stories, but it doesn't stab us in a way that depletes us. It actually, I can speak for myself, it strengthens our resolve. And it doesn't beat us down so that it is sustainable. And part of the reason it's sustainable is the good news that we are creating as well as watching. So who would like to go first? You've been going third each time. Would you like to go first? Caitlin?
What's the question?
Share some good news that's happening in this field that can convey information about what's happening and that gives you a sense of optimism or hope.
I don't know about in this field, but in my home state of Maine, lots of young farmers are either coming back or staying or moving to Maine, and they are determinedly growing organic, and they are trying all kinds of different things. We've got hoop houses, and all across the state, we're growing lettuces all winter long, and it's cold in Maine. And we're trying very hard to become a state that produces a lot of our own food. We're actually growing rice, which is unusual. We're growing soybeans, many kinds of beans, lots of staple foods, and we're trying to distribute these through farmers markets and WIC and all kinds of different programs to people of all economic levels. And we just voted in our first female governor in November, whose number one item on the agenda is climate change. And she's absolutely interested in farming and looking at the farming sector and how farming not only affects climate change, but what can we do to educate people and feed people from what we're growing in our own state. And those things give me hope. The young, intrepid farmers who are working so hard and growing food all winter long. And I'm born and raised in Maine. And I lived in Paris and then Providence and then New York City and Los Angeles. But I came back to Maine in 2003 to make my home. And just in the time that I've been there, that's 15 years, the farming has taken off. The farmers markets are amazing. The fact that we're trying to grow things like rice, rice is something that is grown in rice paddies, obviously, and needs a lot of water. We have a big arsenic problem with a lot of rice. Maine farmers are trying to figure this out on cleaner soil, if possible. In Maine, of course, we have rainwater and pollution and all those other things that pollution comes to us in the clouds. But that gives me hope. I'm excited about what the farmers in my home state are doing, and I'm excited about our new governor, who for the first time really wants to make change with our state. And there's an old adage in Maine, which is that as Maine goes, so goes the nation. And I think these days, many of us in Maine are hoping, as Maine goes, so goes the world.
Carey?
You're looking at me?
Yep.
What was the question?
Oh, you've got lots of good news.
She and I talked about this over a glass of wine before the panel. And I think we talked about Maine, and we talked about farmers who are giving me hope. I'm learning and spending time with and talking to a group of farmers that call themselves the IDEA Network, IDEA, IDEA Network. And these are farmers around the Midwest in the United States, and some of them are organic growers, some are conventional, some are transitioning, but essentially they are trying to be sort of our researchers and our scientists for our future food production. And they have a little bit of grant money from the USDA, and they're working in conjunction with a couple of universities. But essentially what they're trying to do is figure out how to grow wheat and corn and soybeans without pesticides, without the heavy use of synthetic herbicides and insecticides and fungicides. And they're coming up, I mean, essentially they're going back really to historic ways of farming, you know, where they're employing different cover crops or different types of rotations. They're looking at row spacing, things like row spacing, which I wouldn't think would make a big deal necessarily, but they're finding that, you know, narrowing the row spacing in certain circumstances, and then the canopy of the crops, you know, would cover the ground and the different types of row, you know, you suppress weeds that way. If you have different things that you plant as borders around can affect the insect population, and different things you can do to the soil to increase the microbial population in the soil can affect the health of the plant, and maybe you don't need the fungicide because they're not so vulnerable to disease. And they're experimenting, and they're trying to match or beat yields with crops that are grown with pesticides. And they're really finding some innovative things, and they're reporting this. And so that gives me a lot of hope. The other thing is that food companies that I talk to and that I've met with, you know, what they care about is the bottom line, right? I mean, maybe they say they care about the health of their consumers and everything, but what they really care about is the bottom line. And the bottom line is being impacted because consumers are becoming aware and becoming educated, and consumers are voting with their wallet. And so they buy organic food, or they buy food that says non-GMO, or they're tracking, these companies are tracking this, and they're saying, consumers are onto us to a certain extent, right? So they watched what happened with GMOs and how consumers became so passionate about that and tried to pass all of these laws in different states, and they see that coming for pesticides. And so the companies are trying to get in front of it, and they're contracting with growers to try to help them figure out ways to grow food with fewer pesticides or with no pesticides. They're investing in organic production, farmers, all the way up and down the supply chain. You're seeing that kick in to a certain degree. I think, and I write about this in the book, I think that we're really at a critical juncture because you're seeing the food companies, you're seeing the consumers, the farmers are realizing this. There's this movement to transition away from these, you know, health damaging, environmentally damaging pesticides. But you see the companies that are making money off of that saying, oh, no, you don't, you know, and they're really pushing back. They're trying to create preemptive legislation that would ban cities and states and municipalities from banning pesticides. They're in there trying to, you know, reinforce policy in Washington that's going to keep on pushing those pesticides down our throats, and the farmers are coming out with new genetically engineered seeds, you know, that tolerate other herbicides. So I think it's a real push-pull right now. It's a real critical time, and it's ever more important then for consumers to encourage farmers who are looking at these alternatives to keep on doing that.
Can I just jump in on one thing, just to tag what she said, which is that, that I think that's so true, that consumers are starting to demand something different, and that is also really hopeful. Yeah. One of the people that, I keep bringing this back to my home state, forgive me, it's exciting to be proud of Maine again. I wasn't so proud when we had our former governor. But the Congresswoman Shelley Pingree, who's a congresswoman from our state, her office was involved in a poll where, and I write about this in the book, she's in my book because the book had so many men in it, one of the women who, a friend of mine read it, and she said, can you find some women to put in this book, please? All of these scientists, all these ag people, they're all men. Enter Shelley Pingree, our congresswoman. So anyways, she did a poll where, her office did a poll, or they were involved in a poll where they went out and they asked mothers, young mothers with young babies, what did they want to feed their babies? Not what could they afford, but what did they want to feed them? And they went everywhere. They went to Aroostook County, Maine, they went to the Midwest, they went to Harlem, they went down south, they went everywhere. And it didn't matter what the education background was, it didn't matter the color of their skin, and it didn't matter, you know, what their religion was. Every mother that was asked said, we want the organic baby food. We want the good stuff. That didn't mean they could pay for it and they could have it, but that's what they wanted for their babies. Nothing else mattered. And that, although it kind of breaks your heart, also gives me hope, because I think that people realize that innately mothers want to do the best thing for their kids. The other thing that kind of gives me hope, and back to the consumer issue and farmers changing, is that I wrote about a very handsome young farmer named Zach Honeycutt in my book. I met him in Nebraska, and I spent a lot of time with him and talking to him. By the end of my book, he had changed, and I don't know that it had anything to do with me. It probably didn't. I think it was market driven, but he was wholesale into growing the GMOs, and I outline in the book the incredible cocktail of pesticides that he sprayed on his crops, which was probably the most shocking part for me of spending time in the Midwest. I had no idea how many pesticides went on these crops and how many of them were mixed together. But what did give me hope is that through our conversations and also through just consumer pressure, by the time I was done with the book, when I called him up at the end and I was writing the epilogue, some of his views had changed, and he was starting to grow some non-GMO crops. He was starting to back off on some of his pesticides. He had a brother who had gotten very sick, and I write about all this in my book, but that journey, that narrative arc of his was amazing to behold, and that gave me some hope too.
Good. I'm very grateful to Monsanto for all the hope they've created. I wouldn't be doing the work I'm doing if it wasn't for what they were doing and wanted us to do. And when I started, I just wanted to save seeds, and I'll talk more about it tomorrow. But today, 31 years later, we find that just by saving biodiversity and growing biodiversity, we can grow more nutrition and food for people. Our calculations show we could feed 2 times India's population by just protecting biodiversity. We found that while everywhere the industrial system is making farmers' incomes collapse, just fair ecological systems are able to enhance farmers' incomes tenfold. And this is actually hundreds of farmers who are seed sovereign, who are food sovereign, and who are market sovereign. And we've just added a new one, knowledge sovereign. Because the mining, this new digital agriculture is based on first tracking what the farmer does, tracking what the soil is, and then selling back that data to the poor farmer. So as long as we hold on to our minds and its sovereignty, we'll be all right. Yeah. We work with Navdanya, the movement I started, we primarily work with farmers, but we also work with governments where governments are willing. And 6 states of India have made commitments to go organic. And 1 state, Sikkim, is 100% organic. 100% organic. We're helping Bhutan make a transition to organic because Bhutan, as you know, did not take the maximizing of the GDP as its objective planning. Mm-hmm. So it threw away the gross domestic product and gross national product, and the king announced that what he would do is maximize the happiness and well-being of his people. So what they measure is gross national happiness. And I got a letter from the last Prime Minister saying, I can't see us growing happiness in any other way than growing organic. Will you help us? So we are helping them. And the most beautiful is, all of Navdania's communities, their pledges, we're not going to allow seed patenting, we're not allow GMOs and chemicals in our village. And our village will be an organic village. We have hundreds and thousands of communities. So 2 years ago, we were celebrating the mountains. Basically, we celebrate the earth. And that year was listening to the mountains. And I got a book to write a foreword for on the issues of pesticide in a tiny village called Mars in the Alps, in South Tyrol. So I just wrote back to the publishers and I said, we're doing a festival on the mountains and it wouldn't be bad to have this village come, because they had declared themselves pesticide-free. And the mayor came and we had the most beautiful ceremony. The Chief Minister of Sikkim was there. The mayor of Little Mars was there, and our women from the mountains of Garhwal, from where I come. And they took a pledge to make a poison-free world of food and farming by the year 2050. And a farm at a time, a plate at a time, a village at a time. 2050 is a long way off.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, the point is, if we don't do it, we'll be dead anyway, so might as well do it.
That's a good one. That's the bottom line. You don't do it, you're dead anyway.
One of the biggest pieces of good news that I got, I was actually skeptical about it. It was in 2008. I had been traveling around the world, maybe visited 25 countries by then, speaking about the dangers of GMOs. But people would come up to me and say, I can tell when I eat a GMO. I can feel the difference. I was skeptical. I didn't fully believe them. I figured the results of GMOs would be seen as a slight trend in epidemiological graphs long after people had gotten sick. But after speaking to the medical community about GMOs starting in 2006, I returned to a conference in 2008 with a video camera, and I listened to the doctors who had been prescribing non-GMO diets, and they told me people do get better, predictably, reliably, and they could even tell me what got better, how long it took. The anxiety, the depression, the allergies, the asthma, the digestive problems. And I was a little skeptical, and I said, can I go to your office and talk to your patients? And yes, indeed, I did, and it was remarkable. So I started asking audiences in 2012 to share the same answers, and at 150 lectures got the same answer. And a survey of 3,256 people got the same answer. In medical conferences asking doctors about the effects of prescribing non-GMO diets and organic diets, the same answer. And now we have the film, Secret Ingredients, about more than a dozen people who switched to organic, and the autistic kids are no longer autistic, the infertile couples have babies, the people who had cancer went into remission. All these different serious diseases and disorders were reversed when people switched their diet. I don't believe everyone has that impact, for sure. But the physicians in the film were saying, yes, this is exactly what we see in a significant percentage of our patients. So to me, when I really dialed in on that fact, that this was a reliable, predictable, consistent outcome, that people can expect to feel better, have more energy, less brain fog, better digestion, better mood, I realized we have a greater engine now to drive the movement, because everyone wants to feel good, and so many people are sick. So, and we now have more evidence linking GMOs and Roundup specifically to these diseases. So the good news is it works, changing the diet, and people are talking about it. And I predict that within a couple of years, more and more of the diseases that we believe are related to GMOs, the people who have those diseases, it'll be, oh yeah, you've got to go organic. A lot of people with gluten sensitivity, oh yeah, Roundup and GMOs may be causing that. That's already being established. I think it's going to be established with cancer, established with infertility, established with digestive disorders, established with mood and behavioral disorders. And that it'll become very, very well known because people will be able to tell their stories. So that to me is great news. And please tell your stories if you have them to share. How many people know a considerable amount about GMOs? Raise your hand. And how about Roundup? Raise your hand. All right, so...
You have to have a few of those basic questions.
Yes, that's what we're going for.
Oh, no.
Yes.
Steve, your questions.
Yes, I've got 100 questions here. So let's start with you, Carey. Tell us what you learned about the toxicity of Roundup, what it actually does, so that we understand it. So this is the basic building blocks now. Roundup 101. What should we know?
Oh my gosh, well, you could write a book about it. There's a lot of different things that I could answer with that, I suppose. I think it's important to know that glyphosate is the active ingredient in these formulated products. So branded products like Roundup or Ranger Pro or others, there are hundreds of herbicides sold around the world that have glyphosate in them. Glyphosate is not the only ingredient. There are other ingredients. Another primary ingredient is what we refer to as a surfactant. There are different types of surfactants. And what researchers have found, many of them around the world, and what our own National Toxicology Program has just started to study, and has the first phase of the studies has confirmed, is that these formulated products are more toxic than glyphosate by itself. So that is something to consider. Glyphosate is never, you don't go out and spray your yard with glyphosate. You go out and spray your yard with a formulated product. Farmers aren't spraying, crops with just glyphosate. They're spraying with formulated products. So why our EPA has really only focused on requiring long-term studies for glyphosate, and they have not required in-depth significant studies on formulated products, is a big problem, is a big question. In 2016, that's when the EPA finally did say, hey, maybe we should work with the National Toxicology Program, and maybe we should start testing the toxicity of formulated products, these products that people around the world have been using for 40 years. So they started doing that. CropLife, which is the lobbying group, the very big and very powerful and rich lobbying group in Washington, D.C. that represents the agrochemical companies, didn't like that at all, very much. And they responded to EPA and said, why are you doing this? If you need information about formulated products, we can provide it for you. But EPA's, they're pressing forward a little bit on that. So, I think it's important to know that it's a more nuanced conversation. So the studies, when you're looking at different literature, some of them deal with glyphosate by itself, some of them deal with formulated products. It depends on what kind of study, it depends on what they're testing, what formulation, what doses. It's not a black and white thing, and I know people want things to be black and white, but it's not. There's a lot of nuance to this. There are areas about, I'm going to put everybody to sleep with this, dermal absorption is something that people don't know or maybe understand, but it's a very important thing. How rapidly and how effectively do these chemical combinations absorb into our skin if there's drift, if you're exposed to it. If you listen to Monsanto and you listen to that, you don't need to worry about that. I see people out spraying, their yards or whatever in sandals and, shorts and bare armed, and you spray it, and then you go in and you slice an apple, and you don't, wash your hands or whatever. But the internal records on this show that the dermal absorption rate is really, really powerful, much more so than some of our regulators understood. And you can see Monsanto talking about that in internal documents. So you need to have a respect and regard that this stuff is toxic. I mean, it's designed to kill living things, right? So that's important to pay attention to. And I guess my bigger message is, we talk a lot about Monsanto and we talk a lot about glyphosate, but I make the point in the book, and I try to say this at in every conversation, it's not just Monsanto and glyphosate. If Monsanto and glyphosate go away tomorrow, we haven't fixed anything. We haven't solved the problem. You may feel good about, we beat the big Monsanto, but that's not it. It's many, many, many more chemicals that are in our food and in our water, in our environment, that are making people sick, that are combining to really tear down, the fabric of our world, essentially. We have nitrates in water, runoff from agricultural production. We have nitrates that are polluting the water. There's so many households in Iowa that are, don't have clean water, and some of the municipalities can't even run it through their systems to get it clean enough that it's being considered safe to drink. It's in violation of EPA regulations. I'm really on a tangent here. You're gonna have to shut me up. So back to the toxicity of glyphosate. It depends. It depends on what formulations it's being used on. It depends on, what the context of the use is. There's a lot of different things. It depends on if you're more susceptible, you're vulnerable, you're younger, you're older, you already have health problems. But there are a number of studies that clearly have shown that it can have harmful health impacts on people who are exposed to it. That's what the International Agency for Research on Cancer came up with, and that's what the lawyers laid out when they laid out all the science in the trial for Lee Johnson. The jurors found unanimously it wasn't even a close decision that this caused Lee Johnson's cancer and that Monsanto hid the risks.
I wanted to piggyback on two things you said. One is correct me if I'm wrong, but the surfactants some of them actually augment the power of the glyphosate. So
the synergistic effects.
There's a synergistic effect, exactly, and some of them are more powerful than others. And so, separating these things out, the surfactants from the glyphosate in these different formulations is been ludicrous, because some of these surfactants make the glyphosate work that much stronger. And of course, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I don't think it's anyone's job, at least when I was doing the research for my book, it was no one's job to look at the synergistic effect of all of these chemicals together. Zach Honeycutt, for instance, one of the farmers that I profile in my book, when I drove across the Great Plains, he makes his own cocktail, and we talked about how the farmer next to him has a slightly different cocktail for his crops, and everybody does something slightly different, and many of these, what they do is off-label. It's not, always following guidelines, it's following what they think works. And from what I understand, it's actually nobody's job to look at the synergistic effects of these things all mixed together. And that's pretty terrifying. There's a scientist in my book, there are 3 sections to my book. The first one is about the Midwest and the Great Plains, and the second one, I went to Germany and I hung out with beekeepers and I studied honey and bees and what's happening with bees. And I went with the idea of this iconic pure substance, honey, and is it really so iconic and pure anymore? And the last section's about Oaxaca, and it's about corn, but there's a scientist in it at the University of California at Berkeley who said to me, which is kind of echoing what you just said, if it's designed to kill something, no one can tell you it's safe. And I think that's just a rule of thumb. Like, if it's designed, whether it's bleach or it's Drano or it's, a fungicide or whatever it is, if it's designed to kill something, you should think twice about it. So that's an important thing to consider.
One thing just that I wanted to add on this whole formulated product situation, I mentioned this to you earlier tonight, but this was sort of a shocking moment. In my Freedom of Information request documents that came back, there was one trip where the EPA was discussing formulated products and discussing the surfactants, and they were asking Monsanto, and this was 2016, these documents were all dated, and they were asking Monsanto to provide a list of all the surfactants that they had been using in their formulated products dating back to, through the 80s. And of course, my question to EPA was like, you don't know that? Like, you know, these things are on the market. They've been on the market for 40 years, and you don't know what's in them. You're asking the company. You know, it blew my mind.
Well, there was a study that I wrote about in my book, which was that similar to this, which was that the soybeans have an estrogenic effect, a phytoestrogen, and then glyphosate actually augments that and makes the phytoestrogens sort of, I don't know, I would have to find the page in my book, but it augments them to some degree. And then there's the surfactant, which then augments it even further. So eating these soybeans that have been sprayed with glyphosate and the surfactants have that much more of an estrogenic effect and were causally linked that much more significantly to breast cancer. So it had nothing to do with them being a GMO necessarily. It had to do with the fact that they were sprayed so heavily and the surfactants that were used that made them sort of, you know, estrogenic on steroids, soybeans that were causing cancer much more readily. So, you know, if you want the details, you'll have to read it in my book, but because I outline it there exactly how that worked, but it was really interesting to me to read those studies and understand that it's, you know, an organic soybean may be a much more benign thing for women than an inorganic, highly sprayed. In this case, it would be a GMO soybean that's been sprayed with Roundup and the surfactants that come with it.
Thank you. So we've just taken a bit of a tour of pesticides and Roundup. Vandana, can you give us the foundation of understanding about GMOs and what you want this audience to know about GMOs?
I think the first issue about GMOs is that it is an experimental technique. And I'll talk much more detail about this tomorrow. I was at a meeting in '87 where the industry laid out very clearly that their objective was patenting seed. They had done no GMOs. But in the public universities, the techniques of recombinant DNA had been evolved, and the scientists in the US had even called for a moratorium. It was called a moratorium at the Asilomar Convention in the 70s, I think, no? And then industry found that here's a tool, and now we can pretend that we are inventing life. I won't go too much into detail on that side, but the three aspects of the GMO issue that need to be known by anyone concerned with health. The first is there are only two applications after all these years. I remember in the 80s when I used to debate the industry, they used to talk about how with genetic engineering they'd be able to grow food on the moon, in the Sahara Desert, and on toxic dumps. And all you have is the Bt crops where a toxin is put into the crop and the herbicide-tolerant crops. Only two applications are the commercially spread applications. On and off there'll be some news of something, but a book waiting to be written is all the miracles that failed. I remember the first GM crop was actually something called the flavor saver tomato. Now this tomato didn't have a movement to stop it, it just stopped itself because it was so bad. It was really removing the genes that would allow the tomato to show it was now a rotten tomato. I call it the Botox tomato. Because just like, people put poison, they paralyze their, what is it called? This thing we get when we age.
Wrinkles.
The wrinkles, right. The dignity of age. They wanted to get rid of the wrinkles, so they started to Botox. In a way, the flavor saver tomato was a rotten tomato looking young. That's why I call it the Botox tomato. And I remember in those days, Jeremy Rifkin was very active in the GMO debate, and at a press conference, he threw a flavor-saver tomato against the wall, and it bounced right back like a ball, because that's what it was designed. But the point is, you want to cook with a tomato, you want to have a tomato that doesn't cook sitting in your pan. So it was rejected just for its badness as a food. I've since then met some of the scientists who'd worked on it. I think it was Calgene, which was bought up by Monsanto later. Interestingly, Monsanto has done no original work in genetic engineering. All it does is finds a company that's done some work, sues them, tires them out, and buys them out. The BT cotton, Agrocetus. Even the soya, they sued Agrocetus, Agrocetus said, okay, we'll sell to you. Because the costs become so high in these long litigations. So how does the BT crop work? The soil anyway has naturally occurring trillions of bacteria. And there's one called Bacillus thuringiensis. That's where the word BT comes from. It produces an endotoxin, which becomes a toxin in the gut of the caterpillar family of insects. It's not toxic to humans or other animals and other species. But when they pull out the gene to express this toxin and now put it into a plant, it's actually a very, very different thing. That's why the fundamental assumption that was started by the US, and maybe I should tell this story, because in the 80s, we were working on a convention on biological diversity. There are 2 UN treaties. One is for climate change, which is called the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The other is the Biodiversity Convention. One is to protect species, the other is to avoid catastrophic climate change. I was asked by my government to be an advisor, and I started to go to the biodiversity meetings. My government, I said, whom are you sending as your lead negotiator? Oh, the head of Project Tiger. Because they thought biodiversity is about tigers and elephants, no? I said, no, this is about anything that lives and will be turned into the green oil of the future. Just like fossil fuels were turned into oil, the last century that gave us climate change. So I started to go and I started to talk to governments about what was coming with genetic engineering, and we managed to put into it a clause, Article 19.3, which says all governments have an obligation to assess the impact of GMOs on living organisms and biodiversity. This clause was called the Biosafety Clause, out of which grew the Cartagena Protocol. Now, I remember President Bush walked out of signing this convention, said, I won't allow my $50 billion industry, the biotech industry, to go down the drain, as if safety interferes in good business. It should interfere in bad business, where you're trying to sell something unsafe as safe. And that's why in this country you never had proper biosafety regulations from the very beginning. There was a vice president who could not spell potato. You remember him? Well, he could spell the word substantial equivalence. Much more complicated than potato. Because the assumption was made right after Rio, assume that the genetically modified organism is the same as the non-genetically modified organism. And I call this the don't look, don't see, don't find policy, which is why most deep studies have come out of Europe and not out of this country. Because no one looks. And I remember I was doing a meeting in Delhi, and one of your officials from the USDA came, and they're always keeping track of what I do. I said, welcome, you're very welcome to keep track. I'm sure they're listening anyway today. And he dropped in, and I said, why don't you speak? It was a biotechnology meeting. I was training the government of India on biotechnology. And he talked about how approvals are given, the company sends a postcard saying we are doing a trial. They don't even tell you where. The government doesn't go and check. Indian laws are far more stringent. The government is obliged to do the trials and supervise the trials, and only when the trials show that there isn't an impact. So what is this new word that was created under the Convention on Biological Diversity? It is called biosafety, safety in the era of genetic engineering. And it had two elements, but in India we've added a third element. The first element is the impact on environment, the impact on biodiversity, which is why it is in the Biodiversity Convention. The second impact is the impact on public health. And because it also has impacts on farmers, we've added an element of socioeconomic impact, which should have also been done in this country because farmers really have suffered, the GMO farmers. And I remember in 92 when the first commercialization of GM soya happened, and I was on a tour, and I asked this farmer I met, I said, why are you growing this stuff? He said, the industry has a noose now around our neck. We grow what they ask us to grow. Because not only are the farmers indebted and locked in, but even the market is fixed according to what they want to trade in. So the Bt toxin was declared safe under this very false assumption of substantial equivalence. It's a very different toxin. It's a ready-made toxin, and now it's toxic to animals and humans. 1,200 animals died feeding on cotton, Bt cotton, in India, and the regional government said it was poisoning because of the toxin. The central government by then had been influenced and never did the proper assessments. We've done studies on pollinators, not one pollinator on a Bt toxin crop, not one. Because the pollen, the cell, the leaf, everything is releasing the toxin. Down in the soil, we did a study after 4 years of planting, 20% beneficial organisms had died. We did a study on 10 years of planting of Bt cotton, 66% beneficial organisms were done. So we're literally killing the soil, killing the pollinators, killing animals where they're eating directly, because grazing has been part of Indian culture. The second group of crops is the herbicide resistant, the Roundup Ready crops being one. But they've tried recently in India to push for a glufosinate tolerant mustard. Bayer has glufosinate, which is sold as Basta, like the Monsanto glyphosate. We have cases, many of my cases are still in the Supreme Court, and a technical expert committee was set up by the Indian Supreme Court of the top heads of public institutions dealing with molecular biology and genetic engineering. Absolutely the heads of the toxicology lab, the molecular biology lab, and they were put together by the Supreme Court to say, we don't know this technical stuff, you advise us on safety. And they made 3 points. The Bt crops should have a moratorium for 10 years while we do further studies. By the way, they tried to bring a Bt aubergine in India. Eggplant, which was then sneaked into Bangladesh. But our minister of that time, we were all writing to him, and he did something absolutely fascinating. He organized public hearings in 7 cities on the eggplant. I said, it's the first time a vegetable has been a subject of democracy at such a high level. And at the end of it, he was telling the Monsanto guys, he says, you're so stupid, you come in the same yellow t-shirts. And you turn up, the same 10 guys turn up at every hearing. He says, I recognize you, you don't get a chance to speak. The Bt wasn't needed because there was no caterpillar pest. We have surplus of aubergine. We have 4,500 varieties. 4,500 varieties of eggplant. India is the home of eggplant and so many other crops. That was stopped, so only Bt cotton is there. The only new one would have been the aubergine. The technical expert committee said BT should be assessed. Herbicide resistance should just not be allowed because our farms are on an average 2-acre farms with lots of diversity. And a herbicide tolerant crop means you kill the diversity, which is food for people, for animals. And the third thing that they recommended was that we need a very robust scientific system independent of industry to be able to deliver the assessments. And it will not take less than 10 years to get this done. Those issues are still in our courts. Monsanto is in the courts, not just in India, in many places. I think we really need to consolidate much more how much illegality they engage in as their normal practice, but abnormal practice for the country where they have entered, because there are too many violations of biosafety, and there are too many violations also of intellectual property. But I'll talk more about that tomorrow.
So I'm going to fill in some information about GMOs that I find fascinating, and that is the process of genetic engineering. They literally used a .22 caliber gun in the original ways that they genetically engineered crops. And then they turned it into a gene gun, and it actually looks like a gun in some cases, where they take, for example, the gene from soil bacteria, the Bt that produces this toxin, and they make millions of copies and put them on coated tungsten or gold pellets, particles, and they shoot the gun into a plate of cells, hoping that some of the genes make it into the DNA of some of those cells. And then they grow the cells through cloning into a crop so that every cell of that GMO now has a little gene-sized spray bottle of that Bt, and it's produced in every cell. Or they use bacteria to infect the cells, and then of course they clone it. Now the process of genetic engineering causes hundreds or thousands of mutations up and down the DNA, any one of which could create a toxin or an allergen or an anti-nutrient or a carcinogen. And it's disruptive, and it's dangerous, and it's unprecedented, and it's not even evaluated. The companies have not in the past sequenced the DNA of the crops they introduced. They didn't even sequence the proteins to see if they were what they were looking for. Now, there was a man named Dr. Arpad Pusztai, a Hungarian scientist who worked in the Rowett Institute in Aberdeen, Scotland. He was the top scientist in the world in his field. And he was given about $3 million by the UK government to figure out how to test for the safety of GMOs. And his protocols were supposed to be implemented into the European GMO assessment protocols. He was a pro-GMO scientist. He created the protocols with teams from 3 different institutions, about 20 or 30 people, and they decided to put a group of rats, through the testing protocols with a GMO that they knew was safe. It was a potato that they were going to be commercializing. The potato was going to create this lectin protein that was going to kill the potato beetle. And Dr. Pusztai created the entire field of lectins. He had studied lectins more than anyone else, and this particular lectin that was being produced by the protein was the one he had studied more than anything. And he knew that even under high concentrations, it would have no effect or very little effect on the rats. So what he did was he fed the group of rats the genetically engineered potato that produced this insecticidal lectin. But he fed another group of rats the non-GMO potato, and a third group of rats, and here's the brilliance, the non-GMO potato plus spraying into the food the lectins, the same amount of the lectins that was produced by the GMO. So the non-GMO potato plus the lectins, the GMO potato that produced the lectins, and the non-GMO potato. Only the group that ate the GMO potato that produced its own lectins had potentially precancerous cell growth in the digestive tract, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, partial atrophy of the liver, and damaged immune system in just 10 days. It was not the group that ate the potatoes with the added lectin. It was not the insecticide that caused the problem. It was the process of genetic engineering, the disruptive process, the generic process that caused the damage to the rats. And he was shocked because he had been given the unusual and rare privilege of reading the submissions to the UK government by the biotech industry that got their GMOs approved, and realized that they never looked at this level of detail, that his potatoes would have made it onto the market and were supposed to be going to the market had he not done these research studies. And he realized that it was the generic process of genetic engineering that caused the problem, and that the same GMOs already on the market use that same generic process and could be causing the damage throughout the population. And there's a story in my book, Seeds of Deception, how when he went public, he was a hero for 2 days at his institute, and then call from the Prime Minister's office, then another call, and the next day he was fired from his job after 35 years and silenced with threats of a lawsuit. And it goes on, and eventually he was able to speak, and when he was able to speak, a revolution in the press ultimately resulted in the tipping point of consumer rejection against GMOs in Europe. And that's why Europe kicked out GMOs, because of the strength and bravery of this man. But it shows that the process of genetic engineering is inherently dangerous.
Could I say something in supplement? On Dr. Arpat Putsa, I remember we called him to India and gave him a Gandhi Award. And he eventually went back to Hungary, and he's made Hungary GMO-free. And he said, I left Hungary as a refugee during the war for freedom. I'm going back to Hungary for freedom. And Tony Blair was the Prime Minister of the US, but he got a call from Clinton, who got a call from Monsanto.
Who then called the Rowett Institute, which resulted in the firing of Arpad Pusztai.
And for those of you who want to see a little more on, how President Bush or President Clinton or anyone, President Obama said he'd do labeling, and he didn't ever complete that promise. This film by a French journalist called The World According to Monsanto, it's got some nice clips of President Bush visiting the Monsanto headquarters and saying, tell me what you want done. That's the way I'll write the laws. It's there. But on the the making of the genetically engineered organism, you got the gene gun and the bacterial thing. But because it's such an uncertain technology, you're just shooting in the dark. And you don't know whether a cell will absorb the gene you want to introduce. So they also act an antibiotic resistance marker, so that on the Petri dish they can pour in antibiotics, and only the successful GMO is selected, others die because of the antibiotics resistance. And because it's in the nature of all living systems to reject what isn't part of that system, when we do organ transplant, there are lots and lots of drugs that have to be added. In this case, what's added to allow the acceptance of the introduced gene and allow its expression are viral promoters. So 2 big public health problems: antibiotics resistance. Every GMO has antibiotic resistance markers in it. Every GMO. It doesn't just come from chicken in the factory farms. And the new epidemics of new viruses, a lot of scientists have said, are coming from the hybridization of the viruses that are used as promoters and the viruses in our gut. I got a letter from a Chinese scientist when the SARS epidemic broke. You remember? And he said, we are feeding all our animals GMO soya, and it could so easily be this horizontal gene transfer is happening, and the animals are developing superviruses, which are then jumping from animals to humans. This also, some people have said, is related to the H1N1, which are very lethal viruses compared to the earlier viruses. Again, because the chemical industry, the GM industry, and the pharmaceutical industry is one industry, for them it's wonderful there's more diseases. It's a very good, successful business model. But for the people, it's not.
I just, not to be a pain in the ass, but I just want to, there's a misconception that Europe is GMO free. That's not accurate. I spent, the middle section of my book is all about Europe, and I spent quite a bit of time traveling around. And one of the revelations of my time in Europe was working with a minister of food who was actually involved in writing the laws. And so because of some of the, like TTIP, the partnership between America and the European Union, animal feed, for instance, is all GMO still. So a lot of European people think that they're not eating GMOs, where in fact milk and meat, dairy, and eggs all may contain GMOs if they're analyzed, because the grain doesn't, the GMOs and the pesticides that are used on GMOs will still be in those products. Also, Spain is wall-to-wall GMO corn. Spain is hook, line, and sinker, grows this stuff. So does Portugal. There are other European countries which have stricter laws, but that doesn't mean they aren't growing any GMOs. So, I was really interested in this idea of the grass being greener across the Atlantic, and found that actually it was way more complicated, and that what's actually, if there's, I don't know what's worse, but in some ways, this one food minister who I was interviewing did say that he did feel that the European people had been duped into thinking that they were eating GMO-free everywhere, and indeed they were not, and not all of their food was GMO-free, and these were sort of lies that were stacked in a way to make people feel that Europe had rejected something which they indeed had not, because all animal feed is coming from either South America or the United States, and it's all GMO. So I just wanted to correct that.
And I'll go a little bit further and give some detail. On April 27th, 1999, 10 weeks after Arpad Pusztai's gag order was lifted and hundreds of articles were written, Unilever committed to stop using GMO ingredients, direct ingredients, not animal feed, for the European customers. The next day, Nestle said the same thing, and then within a week or two, virtually everyone capitulated. But it wasn't in terms of animal feed. And there's now a labeling law that's real and true in Europe, and so you very, very rarely see something that says made with GMO ingredients, because they already banned not the political side, but the food companies stopped using it because of the concern by consumers. But more than 50% of the animal feed is, in fact, GMO. But there's a bunch of retailers that committed that certain of their animal products would be non-GMO, and some of them have kept that up. So there's a lively trade of millions of metric tons of non-GMO soy going from states like Paraná in Brazil to feed the animals in Europe in a non-GMO way. But it's true that they don't even know that they're eating animals that have been fed GMOs. And I didn't get that it was wall to wall in Spain, although I haven't been there. I had heard a certain number of hectares, but if you visited and it's wall to wall, then I have to.
Well, from what I understand, the Spanish government is I mean, I don't know, but you both won't. That the Spanish government and the Portuguese have made incredible concessions to the biotech companies into growing and to testing products as well, to field testing and.
So I think
I mean, it sounds like.
Yeah, no, it's primarily corn.
Right, it's all
And
corn,
I was
right.
advising the Environment Ministry of Spain, one of the new tricks is to destroy environment ministries and to make everything come under the Agriculture Ministry. It happened in Spain. The Environment Ministry was closed.
Right.
It's exactly right now happened in Brazil, where the Environment Ministry has been dissolved, and the Amazon will now be protected by the Agriculture Ministry, chopping down the last tree for GMO soya. That's why I always say plant-based isn't enough, because it's chopping down the Amazon and glyphosate-sprayed soya. It's neither done the planet good, nor has it done your health much good.
Right. That's what I always
And
say.
in WikiLeaks, the ambassador to Spain, the U.S. ambassador, said he had just met with the Monsanto representative in the region, and he wants the U.S. to help Spain with a pro-GMO policy and to put pressure on Brussels to be more pro-GMO. So this is a U.S. ambassador basically working on behalf of Monsanto.
And just one other thing. So Europe's biosafety laws are European level. And of course, they're member states. But the biosafety was a European system. The UK was used by the United States to call for national laws and opting out of the European level. And there was a vote, and Britain was one, and there was, I think, one more country. They did not get a majority doing an opt-out, but they used this leak in the European level safety regulation to then start really putting pressure on the Brexit. So while Brexit is, on the one hand, the fear of immigration, which is growing everywhere, but on the other hand, it is about getting out of the European regulations and deregulating. And there's a very big debate in England.
There's also, what I've also understood is that way a lot more American products can be sold in England.
Yes.
Exactly.
And that's the point. TIP is not yet. Yeah,
so
the Trans-Pacific Partnership hasn't yet been agreed as a final
American
thing.
food
But
and
the
food
big
products.
pressure, the one that has been agreed to is CETA, where the Canadians are being used. Things go from here, in the name of a Canadian company or Monsanto Canada, and flood the market. And I remember my colleagues had a pasta protest to say, we don't want glyphosate-sprayed wheat when we have good enough wheat. So there's a desperation to unwind the regulatory system of Europe and what they call harmonize, which is to bring to zero. Right. They call it harmonization of the food safety and the biosafety laws.
I think, Jeff, can I
Please,
add on
jump
just
in.
a moment on that? I think that all of this has one sort of foundational point to it, which is that you hear from Monsanto and DuPont and the others that, hey, we're just giving the farmers what they want. The farmers wouldn't buy them if they didn't want it. The demand is there and we're just filling a need. And what you have talked about and what I found out in my book is that both on a very small level here in the United States and on a very big level, that's not really the case. They create the product and they push it literally down the throats of those who don't want it. And with Europe, our U.S. filed a complaint, a trade complaint, a WTO trade complaint to try to force Europe to take GMOs. And import GMOs. And, I was astounded when I was like, why are we forcing, what are we doing? What are we trying to do to force other countries, And I was also astounded to learn that our USDA, which maybe it's not surprising to anybody else, but it was to me, I was naive, I suppose. I thought they were supposed to really regulate agriculture and sort of protect us and, But really, one of their primary jobs is to advocate for agriculture, and that means advocate for big agricultural companies. And that's what they do. They promote the products of the very big companies, both in the United States and around the world. Our U.S. State Department gets involved in promoting GMOs around the world, which just seems crazy to me. But
it's crazy. So I had a whole section in my book about that with Shelley Pingree, our congresswoman, was talking about the trade deals and how the trade deals were working and how mind-boggling insane it was. And for her going to these meetings and trying to hold a line and saying, wait a minute, we can't capitulate on this and this and this and give this and try for this and negotiate for this and have anything stay at all honest here.
Yeah.
But it's interesting what you're talking about. It kind of goes both ways, though. I mean, it's all about making money. So recently I've been really interested in, my book came out over 2 years ago, and I'm working on a novel, actually. So this, in some ways, feels a little bit like old dusty news to me, a little bit, the stuff in my book. But I've been recently really interested in tea. And tea bags in particular. I don't know if you've all noticed that tea bags are often, lately, they're made of plastic. Like, don't drink any tea from Starbucks because it's actually in a plastic bag that you're putting in boiling hot water, and all of those chemicals that are made from petroleum products, but all of those chemicals are leaching into your tea. It's terrifying to me, the amount of ways that we come up with to use plastic, right? And by the way, that's connected to the GMO issue because a lot of plastics are made from GMO corn. But anyway, the Yorkshire Tea Company that makes this really great tea called Yorkshire Gold that my husband likes a lot, I was recently researching tea bags and what are tea bags made of, and I emailed them, they're in the UK, and I said, so what are your tea bags made of? And they said, oh, well, for the US market, we seal them with this. It was a kind of epoxy, like you would make an aircraft carrier. You would seal some things together for it to fly through the air. And I said, oh, well, that's, you're putting that in hot water. So what do you do for the UK market? Oh, we use something totally different. We use a plant-based adhesive that's been tested in all these different ways. So it's just so interesting what is assumed that Americans don't care about. We have nobody to look at it. We are totally happy to help the Yorkshire Tea Company make more money stateside by selling a cheaper product here that may be dangerous to our health. And I just feel like these negotiations back and forth between nations that have to do with our food and the basic things we need to survive, but are all about making money, that is so corrupt and terrifying to me that it's that insidious. Loose tea is the answer in a teapot.
A little more?
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's organic. Well, but it doesn't matter. The tea bag itself is the issue. So what they put to seal it. Well, you have to. What's really interesting about tea is the tea bags. Actually, there are resins that are used in different kinds, and they have all different. I don't know. We could go down this rabbit hole for a long time, but what's that? Even the paper ones are all sealed with a resin, which is what I was trying to say. So even your favorite companies, it depends on what they've used. Yeah.
Well, let's not take questions right now.
We can talk about tea later. You can corner me and we can talk about tea. But all I can tell you is loose tea in a teapot is the way to go.
So most people didn't notice that in the year 1995 and 10 years leading up to 1995, an international regulatory system for free trade was institutionalized as the World Trade Organization, negotiated 10 years before that as the GATT, the General Agreement of Trade and Tariffs, as called the Uruguay Round. Now, it isn't that we didn't have trade agreements before or we didn't have trade before. India was the country that attracted all the colonization, including poor Christopher Columbus, who thought he landed in India when he landed here and therefore the First Nations here are called Indians. Of course, the East India Company, little later. The first free trade agreement is East India Company with the Mughals. And it was basically no taxation for the British and heavy taxation for the local produce. Same thing that happens again and again. Now, there are 3 agreements in the WTO that directly affect what we eat. The first is intellectual property, and I'll go into depth tomorrow. The second is the agriculture agreement, which is allowing the likes of Cargill to take over our food system. And when they came into India and tried to destroy our food system, and they put ads, again, we use 70 processes so that your flour can sit for 6 months. Mm-hmm. I did a campaign, and they called their brand Nature Fresh. I did a campaign with kids. I said, what can be nature fresh if there's 70 chemicals? Tell us what the chemicals are. They allowed to use sawdust as fiber. Mm-hmm. Iron filings. It's all in the allowed things. They didn't just flood India with this so-called nature fresh. They worked to manipulate, to shut down our local flour mills. Every corner, we'd go with our grain and have the mill. Every corner till the 90s. 98 was the year. And the same year, Monsanto Cargill worked together using, again, fraudulent safety measures to shut down all our virgin cold press mills. So, the third treaty is related to this issue of safety. It's got a name called Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement. This is the agreement that's constantly used to water down safety systems in other countries by the United States. This was the agreement that was used because in the early 2000s, especially after Putzai, Europe was having more and more bans and moratoria on GMOs. And Monsanto used President Bush Jr. to file a case against Europe in the WTO. I was in this country doing a biodevastation meeting. There used to be these lovely gatherings we had called biodevastation. And I heard about this. And I immediately said we got to organize a campaign, the Citizens Campaign on GMOs, Global Citizens Campaign. And we wrote to everyone. We said this is not about Europe versus US. It is about Monsanto versus the citizens of the world. And we did a campaign and collected 30 million signatures, which we handed over to WTO. And the campaign basically said, if you rule in favor of the US, which means for Monsanto, you're ruling against our right to health and right to know. And we will dismantle the WTO. They never gave a ruling. They never removed the bans and the moratoria. And then, of course, the European legislation evolved out of this. But I'm saying this to show that civic action in solidarity is a very important force. And wherever it has been used, this poison cartel has had to retreat. It's when it hasn't been used that they keep using their illegal systems to invade more of our food spaces.
Could I jump in there just with wheat? I want to talk about the example of wheat. I don't know if anybody knows how hard Monsanto tried to bring a GMO wheat to market at all. I mean, but I think that's a good example of what you just said. The wheat industry, and this was in the early 2000s, and Monsanto was hoping to do what it did with soybeans and corn and cotton and introduce a genetically engineered Roundup Ready wheat. And, I covered the wheat market. I covered the futures market. I covered cash. I was out in the fields with the farmers who grew the wheat, and I traversed hundreds of farm fields talking to farmers. And what I found out, and I started going to meetings with Monsanto and the wheat growers, and what it became very clear is wheat farmers really didn't want Roundup Ready wheat. They really did not want Roundup Ready wheat. And Monsanto really wanted them to want Roundup Ready wheat. And you had this just sort of strange conversations going on that became increasingly political, as well as, sort of threatening to the wheat industry. And Monsanto, arm twisted and tried to get people appointed to committees and tried to do all of these things. And they had developed a Roundup Ready wheat and it was ready to go and they were going to introduce it. And foreign markets started saying, you know what, you do that, we're not going to buy any more American wheat. And our U.S. farmers were very afraid that they were going to lose their export markets. And it became a very big deal. But Monsanto was determined that they were going to roll out this Roundup Ready wheat. And they started threatening the farmers. And the farmers were saying, what we really could use, if you're going to do something for us, is a disease-resistant wheat. Spring wheat growers in particular, they weren't opposed to biotech by any means. They just didn't need to spray their wheat with Roundup. But they were having problems with disease. And they said, why don't you work on a genetic technology that'll help us fight this disease? And Monsanto said, yeah, no. Maybe we'll do that for you later down the road. But we want to sell you Roundup Ready wheat. And this became, it became a very, very big deal. And I don't know, I feel like maybe I had a small part in, I don't know. But I was sitting down with the CEO of Monsanto as all of this sort of was happening. And I said, what are you doing? What are you doing? They don't want it. Foreign markets don't want it. You introduce it, foreign markets don't buy it. Wheat market, crashes, and it's all going to be on you guys. What are you doing? And within a couple of months, they said they were going to shelve Roundup Ready wheat. And they have, and there still is not a Roundup Ready wheat out there. But it just illustrated for me, and I wrote about that in my book, and there were a lot of internal documents laid out. It wasn't about the farmer. It wasn't about helping the farmer. It wasn't about what the farmer wanted or what the farmer needed. It wasn't about growing more food, feeding the world. It was about selling more chemicals. And I think that is the most clear example of all about what all of this is about. Pressure on Europe, pressure on foreign markets, pressure on farmers. It's not about feeding the world. It's about selling more chemicals.
It's interesting that when Monsanto dropped the wheat, I think it was May 10th, 2004, as they announced it, all of the wheat associations were against it. But I have seen some internal documents and knew that Monsanto was not willing to take no for an answer, and they actually infiltrated the different wheat organizations,
they did, yeah.
which are now calling for GMO wheat. The same company, the same organizations that were against it. And they have an interesting way, and I know that Vandana probably has a similar situation. When we travel around the world and visit different activists and we give the lay of the land, they'll tell us which ministries are owned by Monsanto, now Bayer, which ministers are working on their behest and which ones are reasonable. And I find that the ones that are working on their behest, I can't meet with because they've been told don't meet with Jeffrey Smith. But the ones that are open-minded, I can meet with and give the details. So it's amazing how much pressure and capacity they have around the world.
Can we talk just quickly, can I tell the story of the European Union and what
Please.
went down? I don't know if people know, but in the fall of 2017, the European Union, glyphosate's license in Europe was expiring, and so they were trying to, I mentioned this earlier, which is why I was called to testify, had to determine whether or not to vote to re-register glyphosate, and they had actually already delayed for, I think, a year and a half because the European states were so divided on this issue, and they could not get a qualified majority of European states to agree. They had to have a certain, number. It's based on population and that sort of thing. And they were coming down to the wire when the license was expiring in December, and they had to have another vote, and they had to have a count, and they still couldn't get it, and this went on and on. They could not get a qualified majority. And Germany, which would be a huge swing vote, which was where Bayer is based, and this was before Bayer bought Monsanto, but when they wanted to buy them, but Germany was going to abstain, and they said, we don't agree. Our ministers do not agree on this, and so we are abstaining. And this went down to the wire. They didn't have a qualified majority, and then all of a sudden, at the last minute, the ag minister in Germany came in and swung the vote in favor of re-registering glyphosate.
An interim guy.
Without approval of the rest of the government. And it shocked everybody, and Angela Merkel was furious, and there was a big outrage, but his vote carried the day, and glyphosate was re-registered and reauthorized for the market, only for 5 years. not for the extended period that Monsanto wanted. But, you know, I mean, again, that just illustrates the political power.
It's so interesting because in Germany, there's so many people in Germany were against it. Yeah.
Yeah. So
And
many
we're
leaders
fighting so hard.
So many leaders in the government there.
Yeah.
But this one, you know, individual is able to come in and offer that vote to keep it on the market.
Yeah.
I one time talked to a person who, I can't tell you which country because he told me in confidence, but he was in charge of making the determination whether the country was going to take GMOs. And he said that in the first meeting with Monsanto's representative said, oh, and after you approve it, you're going to get a very, very well-paid job. We'll get you a very well-paid job. No, but let's get back to the approvals. And he refused. Unfortunately, he's not in the position anymore, and the government did cave. So we have about 8 minutes before we wrap up, and there's 4 of us, so that gives us a couple of minutes each to give any remarks that we want to add. Who would like to begin? Why don't you start?
Do we not want to do questions? No?
I think, Stephen, you haven't asked me last night not to do questions because it's being live broadcast and it's a little hard to get the. Do you want to do questions from the audience? All right, because I was going under the assumption that you did not want to because that's what it was last night. Do we want to end right at 9:30? Okay.
God, no, we need to end at 9:30.
I think we have some tired.
I have to get up early and fly back to my Eden of Maine. So we could do it either way. We could each take 2 questions. How about that?
I'm always far more interested in what
They
the
have
audience
All right,
has
that's
to say
fine.
Me too.
than
How
what
about,
you
how
guys
about
have to
each?
say.
I'll take. I can start, and if there are 2 questions for me, I'll take them. And
All right.
then we can go
I
down
tell you
the line.
what, you got 2 minutes. You can take it as questions or your.
Or my statement. I'll take them as questions. I'd far prefer to hear from you. Oh my God! So there's so many of you. You'll have to give some of them to Carey. Yes.
Take the microphone, please.
Shoot, we can't hear you. I can repeat your question if you.
Oh, it'll work. They'll just turn it on.
Besides Maine,
Besides Maine.
are there any other states in the union that you would recommend maybe we could move to that are the most organic and the most conscious, you know, cities, states, or even countries? Who's like the leading
Where do I dream about going? The problem is I don't think we're safe anywhere because, you know, one of the things I talk about in my book is rainfall, pesticides being carried by clouds, a study that the National Geologic Survey did, even with, you know, the most buffered place, our soil, our water, our rain, and we've got climate change and we have the threat of nuclear war. So, you know, you pick your thing right now. I mean, you know, Vermont is a great state. There's a lot going on in Vermont. There are great wild places still in Canada. But we can't run away from what has happened here. The only thing we can do now is put our feet on the ground and start really working together to clean up the mess we've made. And as much as I would like to run away too, and run away with my children, I don't know where to go. So. Yeah, and don't come to Maine. Please don't come. Yeah, one more. Oh, well, I said they could have 2 questions, so let me just do the next question. Yeah. The tea bags that seem like they're made out of?
Like a fabric? They're not, they're plastic?
Yes.
Whoa.
Vinyl.
They feel like gauze, right? But it's not? Like
Most of the time, no. You just have to call that tea company, but a lot of them are plastic. I mean, there are some that are made out of organic cotton, you know, but that requires more digging. Yeah.
All right, next question for Vandana or Carey. Right over here.
Thank you. Okay, does the European Union have any kind of a stamp, like we look for the USDA, we look for specific symbols when we buy food that it's organic? Is there anything like that in the European Union, Italy especially?
They have many organic labels, and bio is the word they use.
To be trusted?
More trusted than out here.
Thank you.
But I just want to say to the last question, I think one thing Americans will have to stop doing is wanting to run away. You have to just join hands with us to keep the dirty stuff out from India and here and every other country.
Okay, who has the, there's someone raising their hand there.
Hi. Monsanto is such a villainous company, the way it's been painted. Why isn't there more information out there? You're exposing it all, but I mean, I'm an avid reader of the New York Times, and I rarely read about Monsanto. Why isn't the public just made more aware of what is going on?
Go ahead, Carey.
Well, I mean, from where I sit, I'm doing my part. I don't know. I think there are many answers to that question. There's a lot of other things to write about in the world, right? I mean, there are a lot of things going on. I think the New York Times has done a pretty good job about this. I mean, Eric Lipton did a very big story in 2015. He used emails that my organization I work for now, I left Reuters, I work for US Right to Know now. It's a nonprofit, and pretty much all I do now is file freedom of information request. My colleagues do the same, and that's what we do.
Danny Hakam did that huge piece in the fall of 2016.
Eric Lipton did
Danny did a
Danny's
big
done a piece, but Eric Lipton did a very big expose on what's been going on secretly with all of these emails and Monsanto paying academics. He's been sued now, and the New York Times has been sued. So I mean, that might be one element. They come back at you hard. And the other thing is that reporters generally, I mean, I felt it at Reuters every single day. Caitlin felt it over her book. I know reporters at the New York Times, others other than Eric, when you write stories that do not reflect favorably on Monsanto or others in the agrochemical industry, and mainly Monsanto. I mean, I would get feedback from Dow and DuPont, and they'd say, yeah, I really didn't like that story, Carey, whatever. Monsanto, they come after you really hard all the time.
And sometimes you don't even know. They're just insidiously doing things that come after you.
And so if you're a young reporter, I'm an old dog, like they didn't faze me, but if you're a young reporter, I think you would just say, you know what, I don't need the headache. I don't need my editor coming to me saying, why are these people emailing me? What is going on? Why are you doing this? It's hard. And it's hard by design. They want it to be hard. They want you not to write the story that they don't want you to write. So, yeah.
I'll give just, why don't we hear more about this? Monsanto, mentioned, came in illegally, and the illegal trials also were doing very badly. And I was about the only one talking about their BT cotton and the GMOs. And so there was a TV channel that asked me to come in and talk about it and explain what GMOs are and what's BT cotton and how is it doing. And they did a whole 1-hour program on national TV. Of course, it was aired, it was live. They got a call saying, don't you dare do a program like this covering these topics ever again. We're going to sue you so much, you're going to shut down.
Yeah.
The owners backed off. That's all it takes, a phone call about being sued. For very long, I've had columns in Indian newspapers. And the last one was a newspaper called Asian Age. And I was writing, I think, about the GM mustard. And interestingly, our environment minister, who was topping it, died very, very mysteriously. But this article was written. Asian Age got a call saying, they have to put a full page counter, which was a big advertisement, not an article, about all their future crops. It was not a line about saying what I'd said was not true. And they put a condition. And Asian Age called me and said, Dr. Shiva, either we exist as a paper or we've got to shut down your column. I said, shut down my column.
Yeah.
So this is why you don't hear more.
Right, yeah. I write for magazines now, and the newspaper. I was involved in a webinar with the Security and Sustainability Forum that looks at sort of global issues. And every article I write, they go to the editors of those publications and pressure them to not let me write for them again. This webinar with the Security and Sustainability Forum, they were shocked, because they deal with national security questions and things, and they hadn't really explored this issue, and they were shocked. They started getting all of these emails ahead of the webinar, pressure to pull it, to cancel it. Sponsors got a lot of pressure. They do little, they do big, they try to shut it down.
So it is 9:30. There are a lot of hands up, but there are some tired people on the panel. So I want to say that what we just heard, and the pressure and the threats, and I think we've all shared them, except I didn't share mine. Bruce Chassey, who was mentioned here a couple of times, he was paid a lot of money to try and discredit my book, Genetic Roulette, and came up with an entire website with dozens and dozens of pages lying about what my book said in order to fight the book, because the book had taken hold all around the world and was being used as evidence that GMOs were unsafe. So he's not my favorite person, but I might be his, because he got paid a lot of money to try and attack me. So I want to express this, that I would love to hear from you a heartfelt appreciation for what these people on this panel have done to stand up to the truth, to withstand the pressure, and to be here to give you that truth.